This transmission is a 722.9 7-speed automatic that was produced from 2004 right up to 2016. That's 12 years. Can you imagine how many transmissions there are out there? Mid 2010, they changed the transmission. So if you're doing a 2010 or 2011, you need to figure out which transmission you have, whether you have the 722.9 or the 722.9 Plus. The Plus has a code designation A89. And everybody says, well, where do I find the code? Is it stamped on the transmission? You know, where is this silly code? Well, you don't need the code. There is another way to tell which transmission you have. You can check the color of the fluid, but how do you do that? There's no dipstick. So I'm going to show you now an easy way to check which transmission you have. But if you want to find the code A89, you can do it by getting your VIN number, going online, and finding a VIN decoder, and you put your VIN in, it will show all the options that your car has. That's one way you can do it. I thought I would show you how I tell the difference very quickly. The change included changing the filter, changing the pan, and changing the fluid. If you look here on my right, this is the pan and filter out of a 722.9. On my left is a pan and filter out of a 722.9 Plus, or code A89. I want to show you the difference here. If you look first at the pan, you'll notice that the newer pan is deeper, just by about 3/8 of an inch. And you'll also notice, if you look at the bottom of the pan, there's a difference here. These early transmissions have these little teeny flat dimples. Now look at the bottom of the pan on the 722.9 Plus. Look at how deep those dimples are. Now what's the purpose of those dimples? Let's flip it over and I'll explain. The second change is a filter. You know, you look at the filters, they look pretty much the same, but look at right there. See the depth? The 722.9 Plus filter is deeper. And these filters sit just like this on the bottom of the pan. Okay? Now, if you flip it over, you can see here's the intake to the filter. The intake to the filter hasn't changed. So that's the primary difference. And along with that, they came up with a low friction fluid change and changed the color of the fluid. So you could not mix fluids between these two, but I'm going to take you underneath the C350 here, and I want you to determine which transmission this car has. Is this the Plus with the code A89, or is this the early model before mid-2010? Why in the world did Mercedes make a change in the pan anyway? Now, both these cars, both this C350 and this W221 S550 are mid-2010 cars, and at that point, you need to be a little concerned. Which transmission do you have? If you have up to a 2009, you're going to have the early transmission. If you're going to have a 2012 or later, probably don't have to worry about it. So now I've got the W221 up in the air. As with the W204, I had to remove the underbody panels to get a close look at this pan. But this is what you're looking at right here. These four little dimples. See those? And on this one, it also has the early transmission. And by early, I mean it has the smaller pan. And we talked about this whole issue with the size of the dimples on the bottom of the pan. If you have some model up to 2009 and you want to do a transmission service, I recommend you go into the car and look at the pan first. Because if someone already made the conversion to the later pan and the later filter, if you order a new filter, it's not going to work. The bolts, the gasket, they're all the same. But just a caution there, I feel the best way is to look at the bottom of the pan. There's no confusion there. Either it has these small dimples that you see here, or it's going to have the deeper dimples that you see here. So yesterday I finished up on the C350, and I'm going to take you now and show you some highlights. I've already done a couple of videos. There's lots of videos on YouTube on how to do this transmission service. I have a few unique perspectives and a unique tank that we'll talk about later. But take a look and you'll see that this transmission was actually in very good condition. I mentioned in a previous video that you could pull this plug and drain the fluid, check for color. Of course, the early transmission color is red and the later transmission is blue, but if it's really dirty, it's really hard to tell. But I like to drain a little bit out and inspect it before I start draining the whole lot. If you're going to take a sample, make sure you put a larger pan underneath. Anytime you work on a 722.9 transmission, you have to be prepared. The job can get very messy with all the fluid in these transmissions. If you're not careful, you'll have fluid over everything, and it's very hard to clean up because it's super slippery. So what I do is I get a drip pan, so if I happen to make a mistake and splash, it's not going to go on the floor. Then I take and put a pan here that's going to hold whatever drains out of the pan. And then finally, I want to take my sample with all this in place. To keep your arm out of the way or it's going to leak down your arm. How do I know that? All right, that's pretty good. It's nice and red. So we know for sure that this is the early 722.9. Now you see, leaving this on a hex wrench is a lot easier than trying to grab this slippery plug and getting it back in. But now I can take this over to the bench and inspect it. It's not bright red, so it doesn't mean it's new, but it's not brown. Usually these will take on a brown cast if they've been in the transmission for a long period of time. Now I do have maintenance records on this car. They said they had a transmission service about 20,000 miles ago, but I don't know if that was a full service. I don't know if it was, you know, a full flush or whatever. They may have just put 4 quarts in and a new filter. But the main reason I want to do the service on this C350 is I want to install the new pan in the high performance filter. Here's a warning I want to share with you. I just bet you that there's been a lot of major spills on garage floors because people did not realize how much fluid is still in the pan, even though you knock off this standpipe and drain the plug into a pan. This is almost a liter of fluid. So you have to be really careful, even though you've drained it. And I showed this in an earlier video. If you're by yourself, what I recommend you do is leave the 2 bolts loose, remove the front 4 bolts, and tip the pan and let it drain off. Now, I pulled this off with my helper, and it took 2 of us to keep this level while we dropped it off the transmission and carried it over here to the bench. So just a warning, mark my word, if you aren't careful, you're going to have a huge mess, and this transmission fluid is not fun to clean up. I think my estimation was wrong. Look at this, 1.5 liters of transmission fluid still in the pan after you've drained it. Drainer beware. So now I can really inspect the fluid once it's drained off the pan. What I'm looking for is sludge buildup and any signs of fine silvery little particles. That's real bad. But this here is just kind of normal sludge buildup. Now these magnets here will give you a clue too. Look at this. You can see why they put magnets in these transmissions. We're picking up a little bit there. Now I've seen these where they're just totally covered. So I believe that this is not the original transmission fluid in the car. I think a service was done. I don't know if it was a complete service, but I think this gives you a pretty good idea now why Mercedes is recommending fluid changes about every 40,000 miles. Not the life of the transmission. You know, previous video I told you I like to let these just drip overnight, and I showed you how much fluid will actually drip out of the valve body if you let it sit overnight. But the next surprise, if you have not done this job before, is going to be the fluid rushing out at you when you remove the filter. This filter is not screwed in place. It's just plugged in with an O-ring. So you want to take and wiggle it. Just be careful. We're going to just wiggle it out here. Look at that. So can you imagine if you weren't prepared for that either, you'd get a big surprise. Why in the world did Mercedes go to a bigger pan anyway? Now, a couple years ago, it was all over the internet. I remember this classic example. One person would say something on some forum, and then some guy on YouTube would say it. And then pretty soon everybody believed it. And the word on the street was Mercedes went to a bigger pan so you could put more fluid in it, and that would lower operating temperature. Well, that's not the case. Both the early and the late model take the same amount, approximately 10 quarts. So that's not the reason why Mercedes went to a bigger pan. Here is the early pan, the early filter. Here's the late pan with a late filter. I've already shown you that this filter is a little bit thicker, and if you do make the conversion to the later pan or you have a later transmission, the only filter I recommend you get is the Mercedes-Benz Smart Media triple filter that you see here. And that's included in my kit. I have a complete kit with instructions on how you can take your early 722.9 transmission and convert it to this later pan and better filter. So they lowered the pan, I believe, first of all, so they could get a little bit bigger filter in, but the primary reason they lowered the pan was for flow. Now, I have to tell you, in the W221, one time I punched that thing and went around a corner very hard, and I got some cavitation in the transmission. That's not good. I haven't pulled the pan yet to see what's going on, but I believe if you look here and see how close the filter inlet is to the bottom of the pan, if you start to get some of that sludge buildup down here and that starts to plug up a little bit, it will restrict flow, and flow is critical. Now look at this. The inlet's in the same position, but look at how much higher this filter in the 722.9 Plus sits off the bottom of the pan. Look at this one. I can't even get my fingers in there. So I'm looking at my W221 now, which is a 4MATIC. And to me, that's even more critical because a lot of problems with the failure of these transfer cases comes from low fluid or poor flow through the transmission. Because remember, look here, the transfer case in this S550 is connected to the transmission and it shares the same fluid. So definitely, I believe if you have a 4MATIC, you should definitely make this conversion. And even if you don't have a 4MATIC and you have a older 722.9, by the time you go to all the work to change the fluid, the filter and everything, you're only adding about $100 to upgrade to this newer filter and deeper pan. So I think you can see why I definitely want to upgrade this transmission on this W221 4MATIC. I don't want to have any problems with my transfer case. You're going to need some type of pressure tank to put new fluid into the transmission. You can't put it in from the top. There's no dipstick. You have to use a procedure to set the level by draining so much out of the pan. But what's really important is you have to have the transmission at the right temperature. If you're interested in my kit, I'm going to put some links in the show more below this video that'll take you right to them. Today I'm going to do the transmission upgrade on this 722.9 transmission in a 2010 S550 4MATIC. I explain why I think this is really important if you have the 4MATIC, because a transfer case shares the same fluid. I'm going to pull the plug, drain a little bit out, and inspect it. You know, this doesn't look too bad. I mean, it's not red anymore, but it's not chocolate brown. I suspect there's been some service done on this. The car has 98,000 miles, and I suspect it was just a partial service, which means draining the pan, replacing the filter, and adding maybe 5 to 6 quarts of new fluid. Now, I have to say I'm very pleased. I think this one is even cleaner than the C350. It's obvious that the fluid's been changed. If it hadn't at 98,000 miles, you would see a lot more of this sludge built up. You can see on the magnet there's only a little bit on the edges. This is not a Mercedes filter. This is an aftermarket filter. There's no Mercedes part number on it. So that's another sign. And then finally, take the gasket off and see how flexible it is. At 100,000 miles with the original gasket, this is going to be really hard. You can see this one is very flexible and is not cracking. So this is good news. This is the early version of the 722.9, and doing an upgrade with the larger pan and the better filter is a no-brainer, particularly because it's a 4MATIC. I had one viewer leave a comment saying, you know, he lost his 4MATIC transfer case and he had to buy a whole new transmission. So if you have a 4MATIC, you want to pay a little extra attention to the transmission fluid and make sure it's clean and really in good shape. Now, this is something you can do yourself. What you see here on this bench is everything I offer for the DIY mechanic who wants to convert their older 722.9 to the newer pan and filter. These are the things you're going to need. I package a lot of this together for cost savings, but you're going to need the pressure tank. And this pressure tank's unique because it comes with hoses to do a power drain. And by power drain, I mean run the engine to drain all the fluid. I don't flush it, I power drain it using the engine. But as I'm going to show you a little later, I can't really do it on a 4MATIC. It's just too difficult. But having looked at the fluid I removed from this transmission, I'm not all that concerned. If I can get about 6 quarts into it with the new pan and filter, I'm going to be fine. The kit comes with correct pan. You're going to get the triple media filter from Mercedes-Benz, a new gasket, and you're going to get this little pack. And now here's something that's very important, that when you do this upgrade, you do not use the white standpipe, use the green one. And when you put the pan on, do not forget this. If you do, you'll never get the transmission fluid right. It'll all be pouring out because you'll think the transmission's full when it's almost empty. You understand? Do not forget this part when you're installing the pan after you put the filter on it. And there's a couple other things you're going to need to do this. You're going to need some way to measure the temperature of the transmission while you're setting the fill level. And you can do that with a good scanner like a Eucanic, but you can also do it with an inexpensive infrared heat gun. And we do carry these on the website. And then you're going to need a little torque wrench. I like the beam style torque wrench because I feel it's accurate, because you're going to be setting torque at 4 Newton meters and then turning the wrench 180 degrees. So it's pretty critical. Those are stretch bolts. New stretch bolts are included. You should not reuse the old bolts. Now, before I continue, I just want to clarify the issue of transmission fluid, because I get this question a lot. You know, if I'm going to upgrade the pan and filter, do I need to upgrade to the newer fluid? So the answer to that question is no. You keep the same fluid. If you have an early version, 722.9, that does not have the code A89, you retain the red fluid. You do not change the fluid. It doesn't matter what kind of pan you have on there. It's the transmission that requires this red fluid. Now, if you look at this fluid, it's kind of a blue-green. This was the fluid that they added into the 722.9 Plus with option A89 because they wanted to introduce a low friction coefficient to increase fuel economy, and part of that is this fluid. So you can clearly see the difference in color. If you have the newer Plus transmission, use this blue fluid. If you have the older transmission, use the red. Doesn't matter what pan you have. I have the pressure tank set up, and I'm in the process of refilling this transmission with exactly the amount that I drained out, plus about half a liter. And I found out that on this 4MATIC, it's going to be very difficult to do a power drain because I can't get the return line from the transmission cooler off here. You see there's a T running off and going over to the, I believe, the top of the transfer case. So it'd be virtually impossible. Usually on a non-4matic, I pull this fitting off right here and hook a hose to it and run the engine to do the power drain. So I'm not going to be able to do the power drain on a 4matic. I'm going to make notation in my kit that it's very, very difficult. You know, you might be able to find a way to connect to the bottom of the radiator. We're going to get about a little over 6 quarts put in. And I'm happy that the fluid's not dirty and yucky, or I would really try to find a way to do the power drain. If your model has a drain plug in the torque converter, you could probably get another half a liter out. So if you look at my setup here, I've already put 4 quarts in. We're going to pump it up here. I know some of you are laughing, probably thinking, hey, Kent, that's ridiculous. Why do you have to fill a transmission from the bottom? Well, I think the factory finally figured out when you fill the transmission from the top, you get a chance to introduce a lot of dirt. That's why they did away with the dipstick. Everybody was shoving dirt down in the transmissions and ruining them. So I believe once you've done this a couple times, I know access is not as easy. This is a much more accurate way to fill the transmission. Now I'm going to explain, once I get all this fluid in here, I'm going to have to warm the transmission up until it gets to a certain degree before I check final fluid level. This is going to be a challenge for some of you when you want to set the transmission fluid level in your 722.9 transmission. There's 2 ways you can do it. You can use a scanner like this Eucanic. I really like this scanner. If you own one of these cars, you probably should have one of these anyway. But notice it's reading 104. That's Fahrenheit. Now our target temperature is 113 degrees Fahrenheit or 45 degrees centigrade in order to check fluid level. If you don't have a scanner, you can use an infrared temperature gun to check temperature. There's lots of videos on YouTube about this procedure. Just a couple things I want to confirm. One is you have to have the engine running when you do this. It has to be up to temperature. As you saw earlier, I've got the Eucanic hooked up and it's right up to temperature. When you pull the plug, it should be coming out, but it should be breaking up. There should not be a steady stream. I just thought I would show you this temperature gun, and I've showed it in other videos, but it's probably cooled down a little bit since I went and got my pump system ready. But look, we're reading 112.5. So we are real close. Within 1 or 2 degrees, you're going to be fine. Now I'm going to start pumping up some pressure. You only need about 10 or 12 pounds, so you just get a little bit of resistance here. And then watch what happens when I open the valve. See, there it is, flowing in. I'm going to close the valve off, and I'm going to release pressure. Don't forget to do that. You don't want this under pressure when you start disconnecting everything. Okay, there goes the pressure. Now I'll get ready to pull the pan in when I pull this filter off. Let's check now and see what kind of dripping we're getting. Okay, look at that. You see the constant run? That means we're a little over full, so I'll let it run and watch when it just starts dripping. So I was really close. Looks like we're going to waste a little bit of fluid here. Okay, here it's, oh, okay, see it's dribbling like that? Okay, that's what we want. Now I'm going to put the pan in place here. I'm going to take this off and then I'm going to plug it with my thumb. Let's see how it's dripping. Yeah, that's what we want. I'll just plug that with my thumb and then I'll bring the pan plug in and get that started and run that up. Make sure you change the seal if you're just under the car checking fluid level. So this procedure can be used to change your fluid in your transmission or to check fluid level if you suspect you've lost transmission fluid and the transmission's not performing properly. Don't forget, don't do anything else until you get in here and torque this down. about as tight as you would a spark plug. Okay, the fill is done.